Hello everybody, welcome back to a new video. Today I want to talk about stereo and how I process my sounds so that they fit well in the stereo field of my mixes. And I've set up a simple example with 3 different tracks where we're going to do some different techniques that I use to make some elements maybe a bit more stereo or maybe a bit less, depending on how I feel about it and the way they already sound. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Alright, so here's the example. You just have 3 simple pad sounds here playing each a single note, and yeah, let's listen to them. So that's what we have, and it's a little bit of a mess in the stereo field. We have some mono sounds like this one, which I intentionally made mono here, as you can see, just for this tutorial. You can hear that that doesn't really sound right. And we have this very wide pad sound here. And then we have something like a sub bass kind of wobbly thing here, kind of like a Reese bass. And you will also notice that this is a very stereo sound. So there's a few things we need to fix here. For one, I really don't like the sound of this thing just being purely mono. And what I would normally do, of course, is turn this utility off, and therefore we would have a stereo sound. But for the sake of the demonstration, let's say that this is an actual mono sound, mono sound source that I found somewhere. Maybe it's a sample or something, or the original patch just sounds very mono. One effect you can do to make it a bit more stereo is to use the Haas Effect. Now I personally like to set it up with a delay. There are some plugins that do this. But what the Haas Effect does is it basically takes your left and your right channel and it delays them slightly in different or with different delays. Each the left channel and the right channel get different delays in a few milliseconds most of the time, and that will introduce like a difference between the left channel and the right channel in terms of waveform, and therefore you will get a more stereo effect, because stereo is nothing more than the left channel doing something different than the right channel. So with that in mind, what I like to do is go into the millisecond mode here, and then just turning both of them down, and then if you unlink them, you can turn them independently. So for example, I can set this up like this, and now we'll have a more stereo sound. Now you'll probably notice that it also sounds a bit different. This is a very vowel-y sounding sound, and I showed this one off on purpose because I wanted to kind of show that most of the time the Haas Effect doesn't really sound that great when you're just using it and you're soloing the element. It might sound great in a mix, and for some sounds it might really work well, but for this particular sound it kind of smears out those harmonics a little bit, and I don't really like the sound of it. So I'm just going to use a different approach here, and that's to use a widening plugin. Now there are a lot of different widening plugins. There's a lot of free ones, but the ones I like the most are from the Melda pack here, which there are 2 different ones. They have the generator and the spread, and these 2 plugins are able to take a mono source and make them stereo, and they use slightly different ways of doing it. But I like the stereo spread a little bit more than the stereo generator. This one tends to get a little bit of a better sound than the other one. And already on default settings, it sounds a lot nicer now. So we can say that we have fixed that issue there. So let's move on to the next track, and here I want to show you kind of what I most of the time do Normally when I'm working with my sounds, I usually have a stereo source already. So there's a lot of stereo in there, but it's kind of all over the place. You can hear that the lower harmonics are kind of moving all over the place. Sometimes you'll hear them in the left channel and the right channel. And that's because of phase cancellation. Of course, with these complex sounds, you often get a lot of phase cancellation, especially when you're using things like detuning and filtering on the left channel differently than on the right channel. That might introduce a lot of phase cancellation in just one channel, and therefore you will only hear like a lower harmonic in the other channel. So to fix that, what I like to do is use something like a multi-band stereo processor, which just allows you for a few bands here. For example, the low band here, I can set this to mono, and then I can set this to a little less wide, and then the higher bands wider. This tends to work really well in most sounds, just a setting like this. And this is what it sounds like now. Kind of cleans it up a little bit. I've overdone this one a little bit, I would say. So I might bring this down a little bit more, or bring this up a little bit more. Either that, or I can always go in here and turn up the overall winding as well, which I sometimes also do if I already have like the shape between bands and I just want the overall sound to be a bit wider. So let's listen to this. Alright, I'd say that works nice. Now we have another sound here, which is this sub sound. And there it's a little bit different. As you can hear, this is also going to the left and the right channel here. But I tend to, with these sounds that are basically just sub bass, I tend to just make them completely mono. And I do that with a utility. And sometimes this might also cause problems, because you might end up with the same phase cancellation issues. So you have to look out for that. And the way you spot them is like very big differences in volume. So what you might want to do is actually record that if you're not able to hear it. And this is also a great way for me to show that. You can see in the waveform that there's a lot of places where it just suddenly dips completely in volume. And there is no real fix for this in like mixing. This is just something that happens in the patch already. So what you probably want to do in this case is go into your patch and maybe engage a sub oscillator a little bit more, or I don't know, take the width of these oscillators down to 0, and then use a stereo winding if you want to introduce some more stereo to it. This should, maybe together with some less detune. As you can see, it also has to do a little bit with the patch itself. As you can see, the filter is doing something here, and that also impacts the volume. But this should give us a little bit more of a stable sound now. So if we record that, you can see it basically doing the same shape again and again here, which is really what we're after, and it looks a lot more stable. So I'm gonna go with that. We can delete this track now as we no longer need it. For now we've only ever covered like individual sounds, but it's often beneficial, at least in my workflow, that to just like take a group of sounds and kind of stereonize them a little bit more or less that way. So I'm going to go through all three and dial in some stereo for that as well. This exciter down here is kind of like a saturator, so it allows you to saturate some of the frequencies a bit more and get those out there a little bit more. So if you have a wider frequency, you can also use the exciter to saturate them and therefore make them louder, and therefore you will also get more width to your track. I'm also going to up this a little bit. I'm mainly looking at this graph over here, where you can see this circle, and as long as this circle is taller than it's wide, that in this particular plugin means that it's more mono than stereo, which means that it's not going to cause any issues in the mono signal once it's converted down to mono, because that's something you need to keep in mind when working with stereo, is that it needs to translate well to mono, especially for dance music, because a lot of clubs have mono systems, and yeah, therefore you need to make sure that your track sums well to mono. Now this is just the general stuff I normally do with stereo processors, that kind of stuff. Another thing you might be able to do is something like an Autopan effect, which is an effect that allows you to modify the left and the right channel, their volume. And for example, I can set up a quick like Autopan shape like this, and this will turn up the volume of the left channel, which then goes down and back up, and that same time the right channel starts off low, goes up when the left channel is down, and then it goes back down. So this is kind of like a graph of, as you can see, the right channel is yellow and the left channel is blue, and with some settings you can basically set how those volumes behave, which is a really cool sound. It kind of shifts it from the left to the right and kind of moves them between the two, between your ears a little bit, which sounds really cool. So that's that effect. Again, you want to check if it works well in mono. So to do that, what I tend to do is to just throw in a utility, set the width to 0. I often do this on my master channel as well, to kind of listen to it in mono, see if there isn't anything like a main synth sound that's suddenly no longer in the mix because it's too stereo. Those kind of issues can easily be spotted by doing this. And you can hear that in the mono version, you can kind of still hear that wavy feeling of the Autopan, and that to me suggests that the Autopan is a bit too extreme, because we don't want those volume dips probably. So I'm just going to tone this down until I don't hear that anymore. Around here should be good, and we should still have some of that effect in the stereo version as well. Alright, so those are some of the basic things I do in terms of like stereo processing and that kind of thing. And somebody asked me to cover that, and if you want some more in-depth videos about stereo field, leave a question down below with what you want to see. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time. Bye bye.